Good afternoon, everybody. I'm pleased to welcome you to our seminar on our manufacturing workforce study, specifically the issues paper. My name is Robin Shreve, and I'm the CEO of the Australian Workforce and Productivity Agency, or AWPA for short. I'll be your MC this afternoon. I'll be joined today by Liz de Hoog, who is the Director of the Manufacturing Workforce Study, and Bly Decker, Assistant Director in the same team. Today's presentation is to outline the study that the agency is undertaking on the manufacturing workforce and to brief you on the issues highlighted in our issues paper. But before I begin, I'll just mention a few housekeeping issues, particularly for those who are not familiar with webinars. We'll be running through our presentation slides, which you should be able to see on your screen. You can also submit a question throughout the presentation by typing it into the bottom left-hand corner, the box which is there on your screen. At the end of the presentation, I'll be asking Liz and Bly some questions based on your questions that you've sent in, and we'll also undertake to email back replies to any questions that we don't get through. Apart from that, you should be able to sit back and listen. This afternoon we'll run for about 25 minutes, and we'll invite questions for 15 minutes at the end of the session, as I just pointed out. You can send through your questions throughout the presentation as they come to mind, and we'll try and get through as many as possible. I'll start us off by providing some background on the work of the agency. Liz and Bly will then run through the objectives of the manufacturing workforce study and the key workforce issues that are highlighted in our issues paper. Firstly, a bit about AWPA. We're an independent statutory authority with a very powerful board. The board represents industry, unions and academia. It's chaired by Philip Bullock, who was the CEO of IBM in Australia, and we have people like Innes Willocks from the Australian Industry Group and Peter Anderson from the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, as well as union representatives like Jed Kearney, the president of the ACTU, and Andrew Detmer, who is from the Manufacturing Workers Union. Our job at the agency is to provide advice on Australia's future workforce development and skill needs. And we do that by providing a national workforce development strategy, and we've just published one this year called Future Focus, as well as a number of sectoral studies. We've released sectoral studies in the past on defence materiel. We do an annual one on the resources sector. We've released one on ICT. Very recently, we've released one on food and beverage. We've got this study on manufacturing, and we'll also be releasing a study on the retail sector, as well as the annual update in terms of the resources workforce. In terms of the National Workforce Development Strategy, we actually use scenarios, and they're relevant to our sectoral studies as well. The reason why we use scenarios is that we can stress test different potential futures. We can actually identify the commonalities. And for the National Workforce Development Plan, we developed these 4 scenarios here, each of which has different economic outcomes. The long boom is a high growth scenario. Smart recovery is where Australia recovers from some of the financial conflagration we've just been through. Terms as trade shock is where we have competition for our resources. And ring of fire is a scenario where there's difficulties because of geopolitical factors in the economy. Now, the important thing is, once we've developed these scenarios, we can model industry structure. And once we've modelled industry structure, we can model the occupational structure of the economy. And from that, we can model the skills that are needed as the economy varies under the different scenarios. They are scenarios, but as I said, they enable us to actually identify commonalities. And in the National Workforce Development Strategy, these were some of the things that emerged. Our strategy would indicate that by 2025, the workforce will have grown by 3.5 million people. We've currently got just under 12 million people in the workforce today. By 2025, under our scenarios, the number of people with post-school qualifications in the workforce will have grown. And that varies by sector, but currently today, about 60% of the workforce has a post-school qualification, and that can be anything from a Certificate 1 to a PhD. But industry structure changes, so in our high-growth scenario, it's 75% of the people with a post-school qualification, but even in our lowest growth scenario, it goes up to 65%. Because the structure of the workforce is changing and things like health are growing with an aging population, we'll have more professionals and managers. As you can see there, around about 39%. The service industries will experience the largest increase in terms of the number of workers, but resources will probably be far more valuable in terms of the export dollar that it creates. Three key growth sectors will be healthcare and social assistance, professional scientific and technical services, education and training. But we still will have a strong manufacturing sector as well, although it might look very different from the manufacturing sector that we've got today. What I'll now do is hand over to Liz de Hoog, who will talk to you more about this specific sectoral study.
Thanks, Robin. So, as Robin said, our manufacturing study is part of a suite of sectoral studies that the agency undertakes each year. So our study is similar to the others where we're looking towards the future. We want to look at what the manufacturing sector might look like over the next decade and what the implications will be for the workforce. So the end of our study will be a final report that we'll present to the government. It will have a series of recommendations and strategies that could be led by the industry, the education and training sector, or for government. And overall, we do take a fairly broad view of what we consider workforce development. So these strategies might relate to things like promoting attraction and retention of skilled workers, increasing the availability and supply of specialist skills, ongoing skills development, and also around effective utilisation of skills in the workplace. So in developing this final report, we want to make sure that we get a broad range of views. So that's why we've developed this issues paper, really to try and generate some feedback from interested stakeholders. The way that we've put the paper together is from a range of initial consultations with industry groups. We also have a reference group that we've established to help provide some guidance and insight for the project, as well as some desktop research and literature reviews as well. So it's important that we do get some feedback from all the interested stakeholders, whether that's just confirming the issues that we've highlighted or highlighting any other issues that you think that we should consider as part of this broader report. Our issues paper is out for consultation at the moment. We're calling for submissions. They close on Friday the 22nd of November, and we hope to present a final report around March next year. So for the rest of the presentation, my colleague Bly and I will run you through some of the key issues that we've found and highlighted in the issues paper. So to get us started, so given that our study is focusing on the workforce requirements of the sector over the next decade, our first step was really to look at the drivers of change, the trends that are impacting manufacturing across the globe, as well as Australia. And I'm sure, as everyone here is aware, it's no secret that the Australian manufacturing industry is facing a number of challenges. Output in the sector has been fairly flat over the last decade, and after some initial recovery from the global financial crisis, output has actually contracted over the last 2 financial years. So the diagram that I put up on the slide I've taken from the Smarter Manufacturing for a Smarter Australia report, which I understand in turn was actually provided to them by the CSIRO. And I've used it here because I think it's a useful summary of the trends in global manufacturing, and they're not necessarily new per se, but they are expected to continue into the future. So I might just touch on a few of them. Globalisation and competition from low-cost economies has been recognised for some time. A significant amount of manufacturing has moved from developed nations to emerging economies like China and India, and these countries are gaining market share not only in more traditional manufacturing industries, but increasingly in higher technology industries as well. So this has seen some Australian manufacturers offshore some of their lower value, generally commodity-based manufacturing, and move up the value chain towards more higher value-added areas. And there's also a trend towards some manufacturers trying to build into more of a value-add offering by bundling together the manufacture of products together with services, whether that's things like maintenance, design, or general problem-solving for clients. Another big theme has been technology. This is relevant not just for our study, but across a number of the sectoral studies that the agency's undertaken. So for manufacturing, automation, robotics have replaced a lot of labour-intensive roles. They've changed some scope of roles to be more of quality assurance and supervision. And digital information technologies have also had a big impact. They're going to continue to transform manufacturing processes. They remove the barrier of location. So, for example, you could have research, design and engineering in one location and the actual manufacturing component elsewhere. So overall, these trends will continue to affect Australian manufacturing. It means greater competition and really will push Australian manufacturers to move to more sort of high value-added products, and it will need a skilled workforce to do it. So one of the other things we want to have a look at, well, what does industry think are the strengths and opportunities for Australian manufacturing in the years ahead? So we have in the issues paper taken a bit of a lead from what we've read from industry groups, government agencies and some other literature reviews. Two of the industries that we do point out in the issues paper are in the food and beverage manufacturing and the defence sectors as two possible areas for growth. Looking at food and beverage manufacturing, this is the largest subsector in Australian manufacturing. It accounts for about a fifth of output and about a quarter of employment. So there are opportunities in the future to deliver high value-added products to the growing Asian market. On the defence side, there is a significant amount of expenditure that's planned over the next decade or so on defence material, and historically about half of this activity goes to Australian suppliers, so this will also create demand for skilled workers like engineers and technicians. So recognising this, the agency has actually undertaken and completed much more detailed workforce studies on each of these sectors. So if you are interested in finding out a little bit more, those final reports are available on the website. Just briefly touching on some of the areas that have been identified as potential growth areas. There's areas like medical devices and pharmaceuticals, machinery equipment for the mining and construction sectors, working off clean energy and environmental products and solutions, and other areas where manufacturers can work off more intangible assets and characteristics like creative design, brand equity, which might sort of drive a higher price. So that might be in areas like cosmetics and high-end fashion. I'll pass the baton over to Blair now, who will walk you through really what the data picture says about the profile of the current workforce and also the projections into the future.
Thanks, Liz. So now that Liz has given us an overview of what the key drivers of change are for the manufacturing industry, as she said, I'll use the data to paint a picture of what the manufacturing workforce looks like. So our issues paper provides an overview of employment trends. This slide shows that employment in manufacturing has been in decline over the last 10 years. We can see that in August 2003, there were around 1.04 million manufacturing employees. By August of this year, employment levels had reduced to 921,400 people. This is a decline of about 11.3%. The largest employing subsector, food, beverage and tobacco, experienced the strongest growth over this decade. Employment in primary metal and metal product manufacturing also grew. Subsectors with the biggest decline in employment over this time period included fabricated metal products, textile, clothing and footwear production and transport equipment. So the manufacturing industry is a very diverse industry. It's made up of a broad range of occupational groups and has great variations in the skill level required by its jobs. Together, technicians and tradespersons, labourers and managers make up 61% of the workforce. The difference in skill level between these groups demonstrates a wide range in the type of employment available in the industry. For example, according to ANSCODE, which is the Australian Government Classification System for Occupational Data, most of the jobs in the technicians and tradesperson category, which equates to about 28% of the workforce, require workers to have a skill level that is equivalent to at least having a Certificate 3 and 2 years of relevant work experience. By way of contrast, the second largest group, which is labourers at 18% of the workforce, have some jobs that require workers to have a skill level that's equivalent to a Certificate 3, while other jobs only require up to a Certificate 1 or 2 level. So moving on to the qualification profile of the workforce, this slide shows that almost 1 in every 3 workers hold a Certificate 3, 4 or other certificate. This reflects the fact that the largest occupations in the manufacturing industry are engineering trades such as structural steel and welding trade workers or metal fitters and machinists, all of who rely heavily on VET qualifications as a vital source of skills. The industry also has a relatively high proportion of workers who do not hold a post-school qualification at 45%. This compares to a proportion of 39% for all industries. However, the proportion of workers without this post-school qualification varies greatly amongst the occupational groups. The ABS indicates that almost 2/3 of workers in the machinery operators and drivers and labour occupational groups do not hold a post-school qualification. This compares to around 1/3 of managers and technicians and tradespersons who do not have a post-school qualification. Also, university qualifications are substantially lower than the national average at 14.5% of the manufacturing workforce, which compares to 27.2% of the total Australian workforce. So what this data tells us, of course, is that the VET sector plays a critical role in the supply of manufacturing skills. It does this in a number of ways, firstly by providing qualifications for entry-level positions such as technicians and trades workers, and also by upskilling those already in work. Historically, universities have only been a minor source of skilled employees for the manufacturing industry. So within the context of VET, TAFEs are a primary provider of training for Manufacturing Skills Australia, or MSA qualifications. In fact, in 2012, enrolments in TAFE counted for about 75% of the total enrolments. So this slide shows VET completers in MSA qualifications by the Australian Qualification Framework level. The data shows us a number of things. Firstly, that the number of Certificate 1 and 2 completions are considerably lower than completions at Certificate 3 and above level. It also shows that qualification achievement is trending towards higher qualification levels, with the greatest numerical increase at the Certificate 3 and 4 level. This seems to be supported by industry. In fact, we've had initial feedback from our reference group that states that Certificate 3 is the new base qualifications for many of the jobs in the industry. Overall, VET completion rates for the manufacturing training package have remained steady at about 25% in the period 2008 to 2011, which is comparable to other industry skills council figures. So our issues paper also looked at the demographics of the existing workforce because the current characteristics have implications for the future. Research suggests that workplace diversity supports productivity and innovation by introducing new ways of thinking and alternative approaches to problem solving and decision making. This is potentially an issue for the industry. The manufacturing workforce is predominantly male and has a significant proportion of older workers. In fact, the proportion of the manufacturing workforce aged 45 and over increased from 34.8% in 2002 to 40.9% in 2012. This is actually a larger increase than the overall workforce, which increased from 34% to 38.7% in the same 10-year period. So what this, of course, means is that a significant proportion of the current workforce is approaching retirement. AWPA estimates that the majority of job openings in the manufacturing sector will be created by this replacement demand rather than new growth under our 4 scenarios. So that means, of course, that we've got a need to ensure that there's an adequate supply of skilled workers to meet this replacement demand. The manufacturing workforce also has a lower proportion of female workers at 25.5% than the total workforce, which is 45.7%. This is the 3rd lowest proportion of all industries, just behind construction and mining. However, female representation varies considerably between the subsectors, from a low of around 12% in primary metal manufacturing to over 50% in textile and clothing manufacturing. So another key element of our report is to look at what the future workforce might be like. For long-term projections, we've used those 4 scenarios that were developed for the National Workforce Development Strategy that Robin outlined earlier in the webinar. This slide shows the projected average annual growth rates from 2011 to 2025 in employment across the various manufacturing subsectors. As Robin mentioned, it's the trends and similarities across the scenarios that we can learn the most from. So the manufacturing industry is forecast to grow steadily in the ring of fire world. However, we consider this scenario to be the least plausible of the 4. Generally, the trends across the other scenarios are fairly similar. There's a continued decline in manufacturing employment overall and across many of the subsectors. Employment is expected to contract by between 1 and 1.8% per annum to 2025. So this slide shows that So on this slide, the subsectors that are highlighted in green are the ones that we expect to grow, and the subsectors highlighted in red are those that we expect to decline. The key point to take away from the slide is that the trends from the last decade are expected to continue, meaning that employment in subsectors that did well in the 2002 to 2012 period, such as beverage and tobacco product manufacturing or primary metal and metal product manufacturing, are continued to grow, or forecast to continue to grow. I'll now hand over to Liz to go into greater detail on some of the workforce issues we outlined in our issues paper.
Great, thanks, Blythe. So after looking at what the data says about the current and projected employment levels and demographics for the manufacturing workforce, we've then set out to identify what implications does this have for the overall workforce. So one of the key challenges that we identified was around the need to upskill the existing workforce given the increasing competitive environment for manufacturers. So almost half of the existing workforce at the moment have no post-school qualifications, and it also has relatively low language literacy and numeracy skills, which I'll talk a little bit more about next. So this has got implications more from two perspectives. From a business's perspective, where increasingly they're going to need to get more and more out of their teams and their staff. That can certainly impact on productivity and competitiveness and innovation, but also for the workers in those areas, particularly with the projected declines from our scenarios on employment levels across a lot of the subsectors, and particularly across a lot of the lower skilled jobs like labourers and manual workers. There may be some of those workers who could be at risk of being able to then find further employment if they do find themselves in an area of decline or being displaced. So again, the high schools are very important because we know that people with post-school qualifications are more likely to participate in the workforce. And low-skilled workers, particularly those with low language literacy and numeracy skills, are most at risk of becoming long-term employed as a result of structural adjustment. So skills development is really going to be vital to the ongoing competitiveness and productivity of manufacturers, but also to ensure the employment of any displaced workers in the future. And we talk a lot about formal qualifications, which are certainly very important across a range of occupations, but there's also a number of other skills and attributes that are just as important. More and more in the future, workers are going to have to undertake multiple tasks. They need to learn quickly. They need to work flexibly. So one of the interesting points that I'd like to pull out from the Manufacturing Skills Australia eScan was that it reported that increasingly there's calls for cross-skilling and hybrid skills that enable an employee to work with integrated technologies, especially across mechanical, electrical, digital and sustainability skills. So I mentioned earlier language literacy and numeracy skills, which I might start referring to LLN because we all love a good acronym. Some of our initial industry consultations highlighted that a marked improvement in LLN levels of the manufacturing workforce may be required to encourage and promote innovation. Quoting Manufacturing Skills Australia again, they estimate that around 50% of workers in the manufacturing industry have LLN skills that are below the required functional level, and that places them below the national average. So this doesn't mean that people can't read or write per se, it's just that there's relatively high levels of skill are needed to fully function in the modern workplace. So an example might be to read and interpret an OH&S manual. So there's some more recent data that measures language literacy and numeracy skills across the population, and that's from the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies Survey, PIAC for short, which was released last month. So this is a study that looks at literacy and numeracy skills across a range of countries, including Australia. So it gives us a valuable benchmark, international benchmark that we can measure ourselves against. So the results of this survey found that only 22% of manufacturing workers have adequate problem-solving competencies, which again is well below the national average, which is about 34%. So insufficient LLN skills may limit the workforce's ability to increase productivity, but also might affect the ability of workers to receive the benefits from any sort of further education and training. Another key message from our initial consultations was the imperative for businesses and their workforces to be innovative in order to be competitive. This is particularly important as Australian manufacturers will find it difficult to be competitive in a world market producing relatively standardised products. Increasingly need to be innovative, target new products and processes, and work off sort of evaluating factors that go beyond cost efficiency. So this might be around building off intangible assets like brand equity, design, different business models, or working off other characteristics, whether it's reliability and sustainability and some other kind of differentiation. Another observation that we took from Manufacturing Skills Australia's eScan was that from their survey, 37% of respondents said that they needed more innovation skills in their workforce. So these skills, they go beyond just technical skills. They include interpersonal skills like teamwork, collaboration, problem solving, and some of the businesses that we've spoken to already have recognised that in some instances trying to recruit for the type of person and the attitude that they'll take to work can often be just as important as any formal qualification that they might hold. And one of the last issues that we've identified, which is probably quite familiar to everyone, which is around management skills, which again is not a new issue that's been identified, but it's a hard and difficult task and not something that will be addressed overnight. So the slide that we've put up here is a results from analysis that's undertaken by the Commonwealth Treasury, which benchmarks the performance of Australian manufacturers to those overseas, so that's management performance. So it shows that Australian manufacturing businesses, they compare unfavourably to countries like the US, Japan, Germany, Sweden, but it's pretty much on par with the UK, France and Italy. Some of the other key findings of this study, but also some other management studies, is that large companies tend to be better managed than small ones. And again, this is relevant for the Australian context given the predominance of small businesses that we do have, particularly in the manufacturing sector. 81% of manufacturing businesses, employing businesses that employ between 1 and 19 employees are quite small. So a common challenge, and I'm sure a lot of the participants here today have heard from small business managers, that they're often too busy working in the business than to work on the business, and finding time or funding for implementing training or any kind of change management processes can be difficult. But it's these businesses that have the most to gain from identifying their skills needs and creating a workplace culture that encourages staff to apply their knowledge, their training, so they can be innovators and problem solvers. Many of the stakeholders and the businesses that we've spoken to already have also emphasised that successful implementation of change, any kind of change management, requires leadership from the top down, or at least have a senior champion. One of the other things that we won't go into great detail for this webinar is there are a range of programs and initiatives across government and industry and the education and training sectors that are in place to help address a lot of the issues that we've identified today, whether it's on management, language literacy and numeracy skills, assistance for funding to support training and development for businesses and employees. And we've tried to identify a broad range of those in our issues paper, but it would take a bit too long to try and go through those. But one of the points I wanted to make is that our role for this study is not really to do an in-depth evaluation of each of those programs, but we are keen to get feedback from you around whether they're seen as effective, they have a positive impact, or whether there's the range of initiatives that are available. So that sort of concludes a lot of the issues that we've highlighted in our issues paper. We're keen to get your feedback. I encourage you all to provide a submission or to get in touch with us just to share your views about whether these are sentiments that you share around challenges for the manufacturing workforce, or whether there is anything that we've missed in our analysis.
Okay, thanks very much, Liz and Bly. We've had a number of questions and comments come in, and I'll start off now. I might paraphrase a question which has come in from Adrian and Alan, and it's really making a statement that the workforce might be declining in actual raw numbers, but productivity and output might be going up. So therefore, there's still lots of potential and a rosy future. And it was interesting just before you answered that earlier this morning, some colleagues might have been on, but we had a webinar on agri-food, and that's exactly the position in agri-food, where the actual quantum of the workforce has declined, but the value's gone up and the productivity's gone up because of capital intensity in terms of more equipment coming in. Mm-hmm. Would you like to just talk about maybe potential growth in the industry and the contribution to innovation and productivity of skills, Liz?
Yeah, I think it is true. We'll be looking at a bit more detail around sort of the productivity story for manufacturing for our final report. But as the scenarios, our modelling scenarios have shown that, at least from just raw employment numbers, looks like it will go down. But generally, the manufacturing sector has had some good productivity performance as well. And so a lot of that changes have come from a lot from sort of technology advancements and sort of and capital also. So I think there still are a lot of opportunities for businesses, but I think for some it might still be a challenge about just putting some of those change management processes in. But we've spoken to a number of businesses already that are doing a lot of active work around productivity improvements. Lean manufacturing process is a very common process that particularly businesses that we've spoken to, that they've seen a lot of success, a lot of improvement, not in terms of just the bottom line and reducing wastage, but it's been interesting to hear their feedback on what that means for their workforce. They're seeing their teams a lot more engaged, a lot more ownership of their job, and so they're getting more out of their workforce from that process as well.
Okay, got another question here, which is from, I'll paraphrase from Russell, which says that this is a very diverse sector in terms of different aspects of manufacturing, and it's diverse in the size of the businesses, and it's diverse in terms of the culture, the capacity, and the capability. Do you think it's going to be difficult to identify, common threads? So I might ask Blythe to kick off with that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be one of our key challenges for this final report. The sector is so diverse, it's going to be a big challenge to identify sort of best practice, particularly because we know that one size doesn't fit all, and we're hearing from the RTOs that we've spoken to that customization of training is a really big thing. So therefore, I guess we're looking for our search to be sort of fairly broad in scope and to identify a range of practices that we could advocate for. So as you've all noted, the size of the business will also impact on whether something is a suitable workforce development strategy. Obviously, the larger business is, the more ability you're going to have to sort of wear the costs of training and development. So, and even for some people, it means that they've got the capacity to become a sort of a registered training organisation in their own right. So, however, many of the issues we've sort of already identified and talked about today, such as business management, innovation, change management, and LLM levels, are just as prevalent whether you're a sort of a big organisation or a small one. So, and I guess they're going to continue to be sort of more pressing for manufacturers, given the recent sort of competitive pressures that they're dealing with. So it's just a matter of, I guess, keeping our final report sort of broad in scope and making sure that we try and find ways to make things accessible, whether you're a small SME, a small medium enterprise, or one of the larger ones.
Liz, Jane asks, in terms of we've got the manufacturing industry, but they employ lots of professional, scientific and technical workers, which are often treated as separate sectors. Are we going to include them?
Well, I agree that it's the manufacturing sector. It does effectively sort of bleed into a lot of the services sector, increasingly more at the moment. I think, at least from a data perspective for this current report and the scope that we're looking at a broad range of occupations, but we're largely using ABS data, so we are largely keeping our analysis at this stage to the occupation identified as sort of falling under the manufacturing sector, and there are a broad range of different occupations as well. The agency is also has recently just put together a report on the ICT workforce, which is sort of a subsector of the broader professional, scientific and technical services sector as well. So we've also just been conscious of not wanting to overlap too much on some of the work that the agency has already undertaken. But if there are certain occupations that would be sort of valuable to have a bit more of an in-depth look at, I'm more than happy to do so.
Yeah, we've got a comment here from Adrian who disagrees that we perform worse in management in Australia than maybe the US. It's quite often stated, people like Roy Green and talking about the management tail. I mean, I think part of the issue is that our best management performs very well, but we've got a longer tail of poor management. Is that what you've been finding, Liz?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of our research at the moment has been based off studies like Roy Green's, and that was one of his key findings, the Management Matters report about the long tail as well. And so I think it's still something that's come up from our sort of broadly from our stakeholders. Probably haven't gone into sort of a great deal of detail in terms of the comparison per se on an international basis, but certainly recognising the need to address management skills, but not necessarily just only focusing at a CEO level. It's really looking at management throughout a whole business as well. So it's just looking at lower and middle management areas as well. So I think that's been a strong message for us, is that that we shouldn't get too focused on just looking at leaders and CEOs and managing directors, that it's really management skills is much broader and just as important throughout the entire workforce of a business.
Bly, I might ask you about language literacy and numeracy and the WELL program. We've had a number of comments about that, including that some people think it's not strategic, other people saying that there are, better means of identifying skills deficits. What have you sort of found out about language literacy and numeracy and how we might improve?
Oh, I mean, I think it's a key issue or an important issue, not just for manufacturing. It's across a lot of industries that AWPA does studies on. I mean, as to the question of whether the WELL program as it is at the moment is strategic, it's hard to tell. There was a review done of WELL a few years ago, actually, that looked at the amount of funding given per industry as opposed to business need. It was done by a consultant. I wasn't part of it, but from memory, I seem to remember it was quite positive about the alignment of need versus kind of industry. And at least from the initial conversations that we've had with RTOs, a number of sort of large RTOs that do a lot of manufacturing stuff, they've all been quite positive about WELL and the impact it has on the workforce, I guess, because it is really customised to the workplace. There's often, yes, and another thing that it often does raise as well is that WELL has the flexibility to also deal with other issues like digital literacy and kind of bring in some new skills. So I guess that one of the key issues still remain about how much the actual management or the people at the workplace know about the LLN needs of their workforce. A common theme that we're also hearing is that sometimes the management aren't so great at assessing their own sort of skills needs or the skills needs of their workforce. And of course, there's somewhat of a social stigma attached to LLN, so it can be an issue that I guess is hidden or the entire extent of is not known in the workplace.
Liz, Darren wants to raise the issue of that if we're going to improve, we need to be world's best trainers. And have you had any feedback about strategies to ensure our RTOs attract and retain or develop suitable industry experts to teach up the younger generation, and made the suggestion about the suitable work-life balance for our most experienced workers looking to wind down, retire? I mean, the other issue is that the vet teaching workforce is very old, and we might want to have older workers to pass on their expertise, but we also might need some younger trainers in as well, so that we have some continuity. Has that been raised as an issue?
Certainly the importance of the role that vet teachers play has certainly been raised, but in terms of sort of possible strategies to address it is not something that's probably come up a great deal to date at the moment. We've probably sort of focused a lot more on sort of the throughput of students on the vet side. So certainly industry are very much advocating the need to have strong teachers, because they're teaching the new students and the young people coming through the system. But unfortunately, I don't have any answers for you.
Oh well, we'll get some feedback, and we can appeal to the audience to say they've got some good suggestions about how we both might attract senior workers to pass on their experience, but also I think we not only need senior workers, we need also young trainers as well who have got, so we can have a balance within the training workforce, and we can get some of the latest ideas as well as they come out. I've got another question here, which is about cooperation between universities and manufacturing, and it's making some comparisons again with the US, the UK, Germany and Japan. In your discussion paper and in your issues paper, has anybody sort of responded about how we might actually facilitate better cooperation between the university sector and industry?
I don't think we've had a great deal of feedback, particularly in terms of recommended strategies. There's been some sort of industry feedback with some concerns around work readiness of university graduates, particularly if they've come from a very theoretical base but haven't necessarily had the opportunity to gain any practical work experience as well. I think there's a couple of universities out there that do actively run cadetships and traineeships. But
has anybody mentioned the cooperative research centres in the feedback to date?
Not that I can think of, no.
Because I think it'd be very useful if we could get some feedback from the field about that, because a couple, I think ResMed and Cochlear, in terms of some of those high technology manufacturing companies, came out of that research interface. I know ResMed, for example, had lots of interface with Sydney and other universities in terms of getting patents, and some people would argue it's the balance between the research and the product development. Some people argue that universities are good at research but not good at product development, and product development should be an industry. So it'd be interesting to see if we get a bit more feedback in that area. Bly?
Yeah, I mean, there is a little bit of collaboration, like some of the new 3D printing services. One of the only two places you can do metal sort of casting and printing in Australia is based at RMIT in Victoria. So there's definitely within certain parts of manufacturing some collaboration between the university sector and manufacturing going on.
We've got a comment here from Jane that I have to say we often get in sectoral reports, which is the difficulty of ABS classifications. Is that an issue, Liz?
I think it's an issue certainly in terms of at least what we can interpret from the data, because at least for the study that we've, for this particular study, we're trying to use what data is available to us from the ABS. And even if we recognise one of the things we talk about is the sort of growing servitisation of the manufacturing sector, so it is sort of bleeding into other sectors, and I think it's important to still understand what the limitations of the data is that you're using, because no doubt there's still going to be a lot of businesses with the nature of the ABS data. You sort of have to kind of identify yourself as one or the other, and I think increasingly businesses may be torn between what they actually identify themselves with, particularly whether it's a blend between sort of manufacturing and sort of more on the services side. So it is a challenge for us. I don't think it's something that we would overcome overnight, because I think we just need to understand what the data that we are using is telling us.
I think some people have said to me that it's a trade-off between specificity and having time series. And if you alter the specificity, you destroy the time series.
Yeah, you lose that comparability.
And so you get the balance. Look, we're really coming to the end of our time. We've been going for 45 minutes now. Could I just say that we're halfway through this process. We've got the issues paper out there. The final report is yet to be written, and we're very keen to get more feedback, both in the issues terms of being raised in the issues paper that is out there, and also issues that might have been missed. And we're keen to get a full spectrum of opinion. So please, in terms of contacting us, that's the details there on your screen now. It's the manufacturing study at AWPA. There's the AWPA website. You can follow us on Twitter, and we're always very keen to get your feedback about all the work that the agency does. So could I thank participants? Could I thank Bly and Liz for going through the presentation, and say to everybody, thank you for giving up your time to listen to our webinar about the issues paper, and could I encourage you to give us some feedback, because that will just enhance the paper. So thanks very much, and good afternoon.